So what is post-traumatic stress disorder anyway? Here are the basics of PTSD. PTSD is an anxiety disorder with a wide range of severity. PTSD is not a form of psychosis, though some people who experience severe PTSD may experience psychotic symptoms at times of stress. Having PTSD doesn't mean you're any more likely to be violent, offensive, or out of control than anybody else. PTSD does not make you weak, less than anybody else, or a burden. It is an illness that just about anyone can develop given the right environmental circumstances, though it is more likely in certain genetically predisposed individuals. They don't know terribly much about what makes one person more or less likely to get PTSD through genetics at the moment. There is technically no cure, but people with PTSD typically do have long periods of total or near total remission of symptoms. Equally, people with PTSD can have periods in which symptoms reoccur, particularly after further exposure to trauma, increased stress, or following major life changes, such as the birth of a child, marriage, divorce, or the death of a loved one. PTSD occurs after exposure to extreme psychological trauma, which can take many forms. This brings about an equally extreme and ongoing emotional and physiological reaction in the individual. So whilst people who have PTSD often have been exposed to physical trauma, that in and of itself is not the cause. It is possible to develop PTSD well after the psychological trauma occurred, sometimes even years later. PTSD does cause specific biochemical changes in the brain and body. These are not yet all that well understood. PTSD runs in families, but it's complicated because there is always a very strong environmental factor implicated in the development of the disorder. It's commonly treated with a combination of psychotherapy and medications. You'll use antidepressants. If those don't work, they typically use atypical antipsychotics, anticonvulsants, beta blockers. They've been proved to be quite effective, and or benzodiazepines. There are some new techniques that don't involve much medication, like EMDR, which have proved pretty successful for a lot of people, though not necessarily for those with more extreme cases. They tend to need that package of psychotherapy plus medication. Individuals who suffer from PTSD alternate between periods of re-experiencing the trauma in the form of flashbacks or nightmares, typically, and periods of numbing and dissociation. This often makes treatment complicated and is why psychotherapy sometimes takes longer than people expect. People with PTSD cannot just get over the trauma. In individuals with PTSD, the traumatic event still needs to be fully processed by the fear centers of the brain, and until that happens, the trauma is repeatedly re-experienced in its full intensity in response to current environmental cues that are associated with it. That part, the flashback part, the re-experiencing, is out of the person's conscious control until the fear centers of the brain have been able to process and integrate the traumatic information.